They seem harmless, polite, willing, even charismatic, but little by little something starts to feel off. They talk too much, yet say very little. They're overly agreeable, but collapse in silence. They show off, but crumble when no one applauds. And what seems like excess strength is actually insecurity in disguise. The uncomfortable truth? The weakest man in the room isn't always the one who looks fragile. Sometimes it's the most talkative, the kindest, the busiest, the most controlling. Because weakness no longer screams. It smiles, it explains, it performs. And the worst part? These behaviors are so well disguised that they pass as virtues. After all, who would question a man who always helps, always yields, always insists on being in control for everyone's good? But some people notice and use it, because while one man tries to look strong, another is silently studying him. Machiavelli never wasted time confronting these men. He positioned them, gave them rope, offered applause, created situations where the weak man's own behavior became a tool of power for the one who knew how to observe. In this video, you'll understand why certain behaviors reveal more than words ever could. You'll clearly see the 5 actions that expose a weak man, long before he notices it himself. And more than that, you'll learn how these weaknesses are used by cold strategists to dominate, manipulate, and win. If you want to stop being manipulated, or finally start seeing the hidden game behind human behavior, stay until the end, because what seems like kindness, control, or empathy might be silently weakening you, and no one's going to warn you about it. He doesn't speak to inform. He speaks to be accepted, and that difference changes everything. There's a silent anxiety behind the man who overexplains, a deep fear of being misunderstood, rejected, or seen as not enough. And so he tries to compensate with words. He talks excessively, explains everything, justifies every action like his very existence depends on people's approval. But what he doesn't realize is that this constant urge to explain himself doesn't sound like clarity. It sounds like weakness, like desperation dressed up as transparency. The more he tries to prove he's trustworthy, the more he exposes how much he doubts himself. You've probably met someone like this. The kind of man who answers before even being questioned, who feels the need to explain every silence, every choice, every reaction. Like a cracked wall trying to look solid with a fresh coat of paint. The more he covers it up, the more obvious it is that something's crumbling inside. And the worst part? That paint eventually drips. The man who talks too much gives the game away before it even starts. He lays down his cards in a desperate attempt to be accepted, but deep down he's just begging not to be discarded. It's like a silent scream for validation, disguised as a rational argument. But no one respects the man who begs to be understood. And maybe he doesn't even realize it. But every time he feels someone might disapprove of him, he switches into explanation mode. He doesn't confront, he justifies. He doesn't assert, he defends. And the most brutal part of all this constant surrender steals exactly what he craves the most: respect. Because a man who always explains himself sends out the most dangerous message there is. I'm not enough on my own. And a man who doesn't believe in himself becomes dependent on the approval of others to feel whole. Have you ever been in that position? Said too much and felt your power slip away? I have. And it was exactly when I tried to fix everything that I realized how much I was trying to be accepted, not heard. The truth is, the silence of a secure man speaks louder than 1,000 justifications from an anxious one. Because silence, when it comes from within, holds presence. It's not an absence of words, it's internal mastery. And once you understand that, you start to recognize the next behavior, an even more dangerous disguise, because it wears the mask of kindness. But beneath it, it's just fear with a smile. Some men confuse being respected with being liked. They were taught early on that if they're nice enough, they'll be loved, protected, accepted. So they grow up shaping their personalities around fear. Not the direct explosive kind, but fear dressed as kindness. A rehearsed smile, an automatic apology, a forced agreement just to avoid conflict. They say yes to everything, even when their body is screaming no. They sabotage themselves in silence, trying to seem approachable, harmless, worthy of affection. and in the end, no one respects them. This constant kindness isn't virtue. It's addiction. It's a survival mechanism built by someone who believes love must be earned through pleasing everyone, and that turns a man into an emotional puppet. He changes his opinion as soon as he senses disapproval. He takes blame even when he's not at fault. He avoids confrontation like it's a punch in the face. But by dodging every external collision, he ends up being beaten from the inside. Because the price of total acceptance is the loss of identity. And there's nothing more destructive than a man who trades his truth for validation. You've met someone like this, or maybe you've been that person, always smiling, always available, always adaptable. But the moment they're ignored, they shift completely. The kindness turns into resentment, the smile turns into judgment. And what seemed like warmth was in reality a plush shield, a soft disguise to hide a chronic fear of rejection. But the problem with hiding your pain behind sweetness is that sooner or later, someone sees through it. And what was once kindness becomes a weapon, a knife, a passive-aggressive demand. Machiavelli saw these men as the easiest to manipulate because they surrender power in exchange for approval. And the man who lives to please eventually betrays himself when he's no longer pleased in return. That's the breaking point for the nice guy. Because the world doesn't reward those who are kind out of fear. The world tests them, and if the man backs down, apologizes for existing, avoids the fight, erases himself, he will never be seen as strong. He'll be used, and the one who lives for acceptance eventually forgets what it means to be respected. But the next behavior reveals something even more obvious, when the fear of being forgotten turns into a constant need to perform. The man who needs to be seen is the man who fears being forgotten. He lives on an invisible stage where every gesture, every phrase, every post carries one single objective, to prove he exists. But the problem isn't exposure, it's dependency. He needs an audience to breathe. He needs eyes on him, likes, applause. Without that, he withers, becomes restless, disconnected from himself. So he shows off more, talks louder, laughs harder. He creates an artificial version of himself because deep down he doesn't believe the original is enough. This kind of man turns life into a display case, and his self-esteem feeds off other people's attention like a party balloon, depends on air to float. Blow compliments his way. He rises. Ignore him for a second. He collapses. This cycle makes him emotionally unstable, volatile, easy to manipulate. He starts shaping his identity not based on who he is, but on who he needs to appear to be. He becomes a character in his own feed, an actor in his own ego. And the most tragic part, when no one is watching, he no longer knows who he is. Machiavelli knew exactly how to deal with these men. He didn't confront them, he gave them a stage, let them decorate themselves with words while quietly pulling the strings of the script. Because the showman is the most predictable of all, he needs to be noticed. He craves reaction. And whoever craves reaction exposes their weak spot. All you have to do is take it away. Silence destroys him more than criticism ever could. Because what drives him isn't confidence and it's desperation, a polished, theatrical, perfectly posed desperation, but still desperation. You know someone like this, don't you? The one who has to be the funniest, the smartest, the center of everything. Maybe, at some point, that someone was you. And that's okay. Recognizing this addiction is the first step to breaking it, because as long as you live to be noticed, you'll ignore what truly needs to be seen, what's behind the performance. And when you start silencing the need to prove yourself, you begin to hear a much more important sound, the voice of your own boundaries. And that's exactly where the next behavior comes in. He says yes far too quickly, and no, almost never. Not because he wants to help, but because he doesn't know how to help himself. He's the kind of man who gets lost in his promises, who dissolves in other people's demands, who adapts so much to his surroundings that he forgets who he was before he walked in. He's the one who does everything for everyone, always available, always taking on one more task, one more favor, one more demand. And because of that, he's constantly praised until he's discarded. Because the world always takes advantage of those who don't know how to take a stand. This kind of behavior may look noble, but it's just a sophisticated escape. The man who lacks boundaries believes that giving in is love, that being constantly ready makes him valuable, that saying no is rude, ungrateful, selfish. But what he doesn't see is that every yes that doesn't come from the heart is a silent betrayal. He commits to everything, except his own integrity. And when the bill comes due and when he's tired, overwhelmed, resentful, he doesn't blame others. He blames himself for not being able to handle it all. And just like that, the cycle begins again. You've seen this story before. The guy who helps everyone at work, but never gets promoted. The one who shows up for every birthday, but no one shows up for his. The one who carries the group on his back, but is never mentioned when people talk about leadership. He's emotionally drained, but says, "I'm fine." Because to him, setting boundaries feels like losing love. But the truth is just the opposite. The man who never says no eventually loses all respect, and once lost, respect rarely returns. Machiavelli never used force against these men. He used tasks. He knew all it took was one more request, one more demand, one more flattering word, and they would accept. He tested how far they'd go, and once they bent too far, he broke them. Because a weakness stretched too long becomes dead weight. And a strategist doesn't carry burdens, he carries tools. And sometimes silence, when used wisely, is the most powerful no a man can deliver. But the man who hasn't mastered silence tries to compensate for his weakness in another way, by trying to control everything around him. And that's where the most deceptive behavior of all appears. He needs to look in control, because inside, he isn't. He's the kind of man who can't handle the unexpected, who gets irritated when contradicted, who needs the last word, the plan, the direction. But that's not strength. That's panic dressed up as leadership. He commands because he's terrified of being commanded. He makes all the decisions because he can't deal with chaos. And here's the irony. The more he tries to dominate the world around him, the more enslaved he becomes to the fear that lives within. This kind of man doesn't tolerate mistakes, doesn't admit doubt, doesn't ask for help, because to him, vulnerability equals weakness. He builds a fortress around his image, but it's made of sand. It may look solid, untouchable, but the first wave takes it down. He speaks with force, imposes his presence, demands obedience, but all it takes is one word outside the script to make him unravel. Because his external control is nothing more than a desperate attempt to hide the internal disorder. Machiavelli observed these men with surgical precision. He knew the key wasn't to fight them, it was to offer them the illusion of control. Let them believe they were in charge, while the real power operated behind the scenes. Because the man who needs to appear strong rarely is. Real power is silent, calm, strategic. False power, on the other hand, needs noise, orders, proof, tests. And that's why it's so easy to manipulate. You just don't react. And he starts to lose himself. Maybe you've felt this before. The urge to organize everything, to control every detail, to make sure nothing slips through the cracks. But deep down, it's exhausting. It drains you. Because total control doesn't exist, and trying to reach it only reveals how unstable you still are inside. And when these 5 behaviors appear together, in sequence, they form a pattern that true strategists have learned to recognize, not to condemn, but to use. And that's exactly what Machiavelli did. Machiavelli never wasted energy confronting a weak man. He knew weakness reveals itself. All he had to do was position. He observed. He waited. He gave enough space for the other to expose, through actions, what he was desperately trying to hide with words. And then he used that exact behavior as leverage to get what he wanted. No force, no threat, no mess. Because when you understand the mind of a man who doesn't know himself, you can control his next move without him realizing it. With the talker, Machiavelli remained silent. He listened closely, gave space, didn't interrupt, and in doing so, gained access to fears, desires, and insecurities. The other man thought he was being heard, but in reality, he was being read, interpreted, catalogued, and at the right moment, conquered. Because those who talk too much always hand over the key to their loyalty to the one who knows how to listen. With the nice guy, Machiavelli offered exactly what he craved most: acceptance, but with a price. He praised him, smiled, created a warm environment, and then started asking. Not directly, but through small tasks, subtle favors, gentle opinion shifts. The nice guy, afraid of losing approval, said yes to everything. And without realizing it, he became useful. A pawn disguised as a friend. And like all pawns, he was disposable, but incredibly valuable until the very last move. As for the showman, he was easy. Machiavelli gave him a stage, louder applause, a cheering crowd. And while the other performed, Machiavelli wrote the script. Because the man who needs to be seen will do anything for attention, and the one who controls attention controls behavior. Machiavelli knew that praising at the right time was more dangerous than criticizing, because an inflated ego blinds a man, and once he's blind to manipulation, he's already being manipulated. With the boundaryless man, Machiavelli pushed, asked for more, demanded more, and watched how far he'd go without saying a word of protest. Because the man who can't say no destroys himself trying to say yes to everything, and once he reached his limit, that's when Machiavelli decided whether he was still useful or ready to be discarded, because weakness that lingers too long becomes dead weight. And a strategist carries tools, not burdens. And with the control freak, Machiavelli smiled and handed him the reins, but only the visible ones. He let him feel like he was deciding, while pulling the strings that actually mattered. Because the man obsessed with control only needs one thing to calm down: the illusion that he's in charge. And when you give him that illusion, you can move mountains without ever raising your voice. But Machiavelli didn't just spot these behaviors in others, he hunted them within himself, because a true strategist knows, before manipulating the world, you must conquer your own reflexes. Machiavelli feared weakness more than malice, but not the weakness of others, his own, because he knew that every man, no matter how sharp, carries invisible cracks. And if those cracks aren't exposed to the light of self-awareness, they eventually become fatal flaws. That's why he practiced the hardest form of discipline: self-reading, brutal mirroring, cold dissection of emotional habits. Not like a judge, but like someone preparing not to fall. So ask yourself, how many times have you over-explained just to seem convincing? How often do you justify yourself, not because others need clarity, but because you're afraid of rejection? How many times are you kind, not from empathy, but from fear of confrontation? How often do you post, not to express yourself, but to feel seen? How often do you say yes, because you're afraid of disappearing? And how often do you lose your temper, just because you lost control? These questions sting, because sometimes the answer is too many. But that's where the shift begins. When you look at these 5 weaknesses and see them not only in others, but in yourself. When you realize that maybe you too talk too much, avoid conflict, crave attention, say yes to avoid rejection, try to control everything so you don't collapse inside. And that at one point, all of this was a defense mechanism, a shield you built to survive. But now, it might be the very thing holding you back from evolving. Real weakness isn't having flaws, it's denying them. Because when you refuse to see your own vulnerability, it grows in the shadows. And a man who doesn't master his shadows eventually gets consumed by them. That's why the real warrior doesn't hunt enemies out there. He scans his own instincts, questions what drives him, observes what angers him, analyzes what he tries to hide, and slowly he cuts away the excess, tames the impulse, and forges his essence. Because only when you understand where you're weak can you finally begin to grow strong. And that's exactly what happens when you choose to transform, not for others, but in silence, in solitude, in darkness, where there's no applause, but where real respect is born. You don't ask for respect, you become the source of it, because real respect doesn't come from clever lines, borrowed postures, or famous quotes. It comes from an internal shift so deep the world feels it, even when you don't say a word. It's when you kill, one by one, the 5 habits that expose your weakness: the urge to justify, the addiction to please, the hunger for attention, the lack of boundaries, and the obsession with control. When those habits die, something else is born, a version of you that doesn't need to prove anything because you've become living proof of what you carry. And when that happens, everything changes. Your presence becomes heavier. Rooms notice, people adjust. Your absence, when you choose not to show up, disturbs more than your words ever did, because your energy has become scarce, selective, strategic, not out of pride, but awareness. And your words? Rare, precise, unforgettable. Each one carries intention. Each movement, direction. You no longer speak to be accepted. You speak to move. And when it's not necessary, you remain silent. The men who reach this point aren't the loudest. They're the ones most empty of inner noise. They're not trying to win over everyone. They're trying not to betray themselves. They don't act for approval. They act for purpose. They don't please out of fear. They choose with wisdom. They say yes with a look and no with their absence. They don't perform. They don't beg for the spotlight. And control? They no longer chase it. Because they discovered the only thing that can ever truly be mastered is themselves. Sentence by sentence they rebuild, silently, and by the time the world notices, it's too late. You can't treat them the same. They don't beg, they don't bend, they don't need to prove, because they simply are. And to be, in a world where everyone's trying to appear, is a threat. Strong men don't explain themselves, they calibrate, and every choice they make, even the smallest, shifts the room, because they carry a truth that doesn't need to be spoken, only felt. Now you know. Weakness doesn't only live in the man who falls, but in the one who hides too much just to avoid collapsing. And if you saw even one of these behaviors in yourself, good. It means you're waking up. Because the real danger was never someone else manipulating you. It was you living on autopilot, sabotaging yourself without even noticing. And the world doesn't forgive those who surrender without realizing it. So tell me, how many times have you explained when you should have stayed silent? How many times have you pleased someone who didn't deserve it just to avoid rejection? How many times have you sold yourself for praise, bowed for attention, or kept quiet out of fear of seeming rude? How many times have you confused control with strength and ended up exhausted? Now is the time to flip the script, to observe more than you react, to speak only when necessary, to say no without guilt, to build presence instead of performance, to strengthen what no one sees, because what no one sees is what truly sustains you. Strong men don't make themselves noticed. They make themselves respected. And if this video hit you, it's because your process has already begun. So subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. This is just the beginning. And the next video might be the exact push you needed to flip that switch for good.